The basic concept of perspective is pretty darn simple. The idea is to create an illusion of three-dimensional space that a viewer will accept. The first form of perspective is mathematical perspective, which is invented by a gentleman named Leon Battista Alberti. What he does is he actually figures out how to create the illusion of three-dimensional space actually based on math. Now, the idea is that you have a window through which you're looking. That's the frame of the picture. Inside that window, you have a illusionary or imaginary room that doesn't really exist, but it appears to exist beyond that framed opening. Mathematically, you can then divide that space into a series of rays and lines to establish how things would look at different distances through the from the viewer inside that imaginary space. If you want to see all the details, I'll put up the link to the PDF that gives the full mathematical explanation. I'm not a math person, so it just makes me want to cry, but if you're a math person, it might be really cool. Mathematical perspective actually creates the illusion of three-dimensional space based on math and physics. It specifically creates those lines and figures out what size, what angle, everything should be in a three-dimensional space. Now, instead of mathematical perspective, other artists, including Donatello, use a different form. They actually use something called intuitive perspective. Intuitive perspective, putting it really, really simply, is moving things around until they feel right to the viewer. In other words, you glance at it, it looks right, you move on. It may not be mathematically right, but it is enough accurate that it simply looks right or intuitively feels right to the viewer. So here we are with St. George clubbing the baby seal again. It's St. George slaying the dragon. Don't take me seriously. All right. If you look, all right, there are a number of problems if you look carefully, but at a glance, this is fine. Yes, the dragon looks small, but everything else in the carving appears to be fairly accurate. Look closer. I'm assuming you noticed that St. George is saving a fair damsel over there on the right-hand side who is standing in front of a building. If you look carefully, properly, technically, mathematically, the damsel is almost as tall as a horse. There's something seriously wrong with that. Either the horse is really small or that's a big damsel. Also, if you look at the arched openings of the buildings on the far right, that's a big damsel. I mean, she reaches almost to the roof line of the building. Mathematically, optically, that's wrong. Intuitively, we glance at it and go, oh yeah, fine. It's right in our gut, if you will. Intuitive perspective uses that general concept, that general gut feeling. Mathematical breaks everything down very, very carefully based on math and physics. Intuitive just moves stuff around until it feels right to the viewer. There is another form of perspective, though, that creates three-dimensional space in a different way. It's a form of perspective called atmospheric perspective. And it's important because when we get to a dude by the name of Leonardo da Vinci, you may have heard of him, da Vinci loves atmospheric perspective. Now, atmospheric perspective basically says when something's further away from you, it's a different color and you start losing details. If you've driven down a road, a long road, when there's fog on the road, you know that the stuff right next to you, yeah, it looks fine. It's bright. It's, you know, you can see it perfectly. It's got the further away something gets from you in the fog, the harder it gets to see, the more it kind of gets grayed out. That's exactly what atmospheric perspective creates. If you look at the picture, this is not a Renaissance picture, but it's a really good example of atmospheric perspective. All right. If you look at the closest giant hawk thing with the woman in a miniskirt on top of it, you have good, solid detail there. Everything is very clear, colors are bright, the sunlight is falling on it. If you look back at the second bird thing in the distance, you've lost some details. It's a little bit fuzzier, and also the color has changed. You've lost some of the warm browns. It's moved more toward blues. Look at the third bird thing in the background. You wouldn't even know that was a bird thing if you hadn't seen the first two. It loses its detail, and the color changes as it fades into the distance. The same thing holds true if you look at the cliffs in the background as they recede. The detail gradually gets less and less the further back you go, and the color changes toward a grayish-blue hue. That creation of three-dimensional space through changing detail and color is atmospheric perspective. So math, based on math and physics, creating the illusion of a three-dimensional space inside a frame. Intuitive, move stuff around until it feels right. Atmospheric, use color and detail to establish things receding into the distance. And last but not least, foreshortening. Foreshortening is the realization that things look different when they are held up in front of you than when they are actually coming toward you. Little kids, if you've ever worked with toddlers, like tiny ones, they love sticking their hands in your faces. Your face is fascinating. Evidently the inside of your nose is fascinating, and if you wear jewelry, that's fascinating too. It's different when you see the child's hand held up, oh look, it's a little hand, than when the hand is trying to go into your eye. When that's the case, the part that's closest to you is shortened. It is foreshortened because it is closest to you. The part that's further away looks larger. So if you look at the sketches of the hand on the right-hand side of the slide, look at the one at the top right, okay? The fingers in that one look short. They look squishied because they're actually coming towards you. The part that is in the foreground, the part that's closest to you, is shortened in order to make it look the way it actually visually would look and create the illusion of three-dimensional space. That's what foreshortening does. It creates the illusion of three-dimensional space by making the part closest to you a little bit shorter. You're going to see foreshortening used extensively when they paint the ceilings of churches and cathedrals like Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, because those ceilings are intended to give the illusion of a glass ceiling where people are actually walking above the ceiling, and therefore the part closest to you, frequently feet and legs, are aggressively foreshortened. Now, getting back to Donatello and St. George. All right, we got St. George here. Young, handsome hero. Little carving on the bottom shows him killing the dragon. St. George is very much in the style of ancient Greek statues. He shows a young hero posed heroically, looking off into the distance. Everything here is proportional. If anything, it's a little bit more vertical, more up and down than realistic. Donatello's next job is to actually carve some statues for the outside of the cathedral. Now, St. George here is being viewed at a slight upward angle. He's on an actual podium, so he's slightly higher than eye level, but he's a fairly realistic statue being viewed at a slight angle. On the outside of the church, Donatello is going to be carving statues that are going to be 8 to 10 feet above the ground, so they're going to be viewed at a completely different angle. They also have a completely different subject. The carvings on the outside of the cathedral are supposed to be prophets. Now, one of the amazing things about Donatello is that he's a chameleon. He totally changes his style depending on what he's carving. Donatello goes from carving St. George on the inside of the cathedral to carving images of prophets on the outside of the cathedral. Those prophets are a completely different style than St. George. The Jewish prophets, according to tradition, were men who lived out in the desert seeking the will of God. They were ascetics. They lived difficult lives without a lot of luxury. So when Donatello carves this prophet, he carves him as an almost emaciated figure in flowing robes. We actually don't know which prophet this is, but the people of Florence have given him a name. They call him Il Zuccone, which sounds great in Italian, but roughly translated, it means pumpkinhead. Now, Mr. Pumpkinhead here is called that because if you look at his head, he's got a great big old roundy, baldy head that's actually a little bit too big for the rest of his body. Donatello does that on purpose. He over-exaggerates. He makes the figure extreme because he knows it's going to be up on the side of the cathedral and he wants it to be dramatic. He doesn't care about realism. Remember, intuitive perspective? If it feels right, if it looks right, then it's right. Now, Donatello's been working on the cathedral inside and out, and Cosimo de' Medici, his patron, comes to him and he gives him a very special commission. He asks Donatello to create a bronze statue using a very specific method called lost wax bronze. He asks him to create a bronze statue that is completely freestanding, no support from the knees up. It's going to be a male nude, life size. That's a heck of a thing. No one has actually created a freestanding, life-size bronze nude since ancient Greece. That's like over 1,000 years. Cosimo de' Medici wants Donatello to do it, and Donatello is going to say yes, because he wants his patron to be happy, and if he can pull off a lost wax bronze statue